Good evening, and welcome to the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm Josh Brumberg, the interim president, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, one of the many stimulating conversations offered by the Graduate Center's public program series. The Graduate Center is one of the largest and most diverse doctoral degree granting institutions in the United States. We offer 48 degrees at the master's and doctoral level, running the academic alphabet from astrophysics to women and gender studies. We are known for excellent research and are proud of our history of applying research and scholarship to address pressing issues within our city and society more globally. Tonight's conversation fits in with this long-standing tradition. We are fortunate to co-host with our Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality this conversation between two Nobel Prize winning economists, our own distinguished Professor Paul Krugman and Princeton University's Professor Angus Deaton. They will discuss Professor Deaton's important new book, Economics in America, An Immigrant Economist Explores the Land of Inequality, which touches on the field of economics, the yawning inequality in this country, and how economists can bring their expertise to bear on this and other pressing issues. What you will hear tonight exemplifies the work that takes place every day at the Graduate Center. We bring together leading thinkers and scholars who apply rigorous academic methods to tackling the problems that make headlines and drive politics. I know that you will enjoy this event, and I hope you return for more. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Janet Gornick, the director of the Stone Center, to the stage, and she will introduce tonight's speakers and the program. Janet?
Good evening, and thank you, President Brumberg. Indeed, I'm Janet Gornick, director of the Graduate Center's Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. The Stone Center's mission is to build and share knowledge about the causes, nature, and consequences of socioeconomic inequality. And all of us at the Stone Center are pleased to co-host this evening's event. So welcome. Welcome to the live audience here in Pershansky Auditorium, and welcome to the large virtual audience as well. So first, let me tell you how the evening is going to unfold. After I introduce our two guests briefly, Professors Deaton and Krugman will discuss an array of issues that are raised in the book that has sparked this evening's event, Economics in America, An Immigrant Economist Explores the Land of Inequality. My guess is that they will find no shortage of topics to discuss. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Angus Deaton to the Graduate Center this evening, and in fact, we're welcoming him back to the Graduate Center. We had the opportunity to host Professor Deaton almost exactly 10 years ago on this very stage for an event that helped to launch his much-cited book, The Great Escape: Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality. Angus Deaton is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus and a senior scholar at Princeton University. He's the author of almost 200 papers and several books, including, in addition to The Great Escape, the New York Times bestselling book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, which he co-authored with Ann Case. And of course, tonight we will hear about this new book, Economics in America. Angus Deaton has been honored many times, way too many to report here. Those honors include the 2015 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, and in 2016 he was knighted in recognition of his service to research in economics and international affairs. In the last few years, he has overseen the production still in progress of the IFS Deaton Report, a large and ambitious 5-year project whose goal is to describe inequalities in income, wealth, health, social mobility, and political participation and more, and to assess the underlying causes and as well as policy solutions. If I may say so, I had the opportunity to be among the contributing authors, and like so many, I look forward to exploring and sharing the remaining components, which are soon to be released. Paul Krugman is Distinguished Professor here in the Graduate Center's PhD program in economics and a senior scholar in the Stone Center. Before joining the Graduate Center, he was a professor of economics and international affairs also at Princeton. And prior to Princeton, he served on the faculties of MIT, Yale, and Stanford. Professor Krugman has also been honored countless times, including in 2008, when he too received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his work on international trade theory. He's also the author of more than 200 articles and many books. Most recently, it's a lot of articles, most recently Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. When he's not engaged here at the Graduate Center, he is co-authoring textbooks on micro and macroeconomics with Robin Wells, and in his spare time, he's an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. In case you are not yet impressed, let me close by noting that he still has 4.5 million followers on Twitter/X. So, again, welcome back to the stage to both Angus and to Paul, and now I turn the evening over to you.
Okay, thank you, Janet. And I'm going to do first names, if that's okay. Enormous honor. I mean, your body of work actually, in some ways, makes me ashamed because the sheer amount of hard work and assembling stuff, all of that. Anyway, but and this book, that your new book, is a little different. It's not a tract or a screed. It's a little bit of a mix of things you're interested in, things you think are important, and a bit of autobiography. And I wanted to actually, if it's okay with you, start with just a little question about the biographical stuff. So in the book you call yourself an immigrant economist. Not exactly the usual image, getting invited to a professorship at Princeton as the way that you come to America is not exactly the way most people come. But but you describe coming to America in 1983 and being shocked by how unequal America was. And those of us, we do this here, that was the early stages of the great rise in inequality in America. It was just beginning, and by today's standards, America was a pretty middle-class country in 1983. So I thought, tell us about what it was that struck you even then in 1983.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the kind words. I'd actually visited for a year before in 79-80, so I dipped my feet in the water and tried to find out whether I thought I might like it. And I think this book, the original working title of this book was Shock and Awe, but that's sort of a little bit too much of an in-joke. But the shock was just seeing these things that really didn't exist. This enormous inequality, really of wealth more than income, I think, even though even by 1983 it was well on the upswing.
Yeah.
The inequality associated with race was also something that I was not used to, having grown up in Britain. So the whole racial aspect of that was not really familiar to me and seemed really sort of horrifying. On the other hand, the awe bit, the upside of the inequality, some of it was really good. It wasn't just that there were billionaires and so on, but there were people like Paul Krugman, there were people like Paul Samuelson, there were people like Bob Solow, there were people like my friend Orly Ashenfelter, people I'd met and knew about through my work from Britain, but it was clear that America was the place where the very best economists were and the best economics was being done. So I was in awe of that part of it. It's also a country where immigrants, not necessarily just like me, but where immigrants have done very well. I mean, there's a long record of immigrants becoming very successful in America. There's evidence that immigrants have been more inventive, more innovative than Native Americans. And, I don't know what fraction of the firms in Silicon Valley today are chaired by immigrants and so on. So there's a lot of creativity among immigrants, and America is a sort of place that gives, gives open field for that innovative ability to work and rewards it, which is why you get a lot of this inequality too. So it's very much a two-sided thing. And I'm not necessarily down on all aspects of inequality in this book. It's a two-sided monster.
I can't resist. I get mail, as you might imagine. I get interesting mail. And occasionally some of the anti-immigration people, and we want to come back to immigration later on, but some of the anti-immigration people from Texas, whatever, will say two things. They'll say, first of all, how would you feel if New York was full of immigrants? And the other is, how would you feel if lots of professorships were going to immigrants? Which, if you, particularly at elite departments like Princeton, but of course here as well. Anyway.
But I mean, it's true that, you know, one of the things about immigration that not everybody knows is, you know, you usually think of talent in the population as sort of having a normal distribution. I mean, most people are sort of in the middle, and there are exceptional people at either ends. When the immigration, the skill level, the education level tends to be at both ends.
Right.
So you get a lot of people who are very, very talented and come in that way, and there's a lot of people who have very low skills who come in with great expectations and hope and looking to the future, but still they're at the bottom. And that's not just true in America, it's true in most of European countries too.
Yeah. On Silicon Valley, by the way, I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but that venture capitalists sometimes will not actually come up with money unless there's at least one Asian, South Asian or East Asian in the team. So, but okay. More of a sort of autobiographical, but also swinging into more substance here. So I've been sitting down reading some of the collected works of Angus Deaton, and your early writing, your early reputation was based upon very economist stuff. Formal models of consumer spending and that allow you to assess, you know, what's the right measure of the price level for different people and that sort of thing, which fabulous stuff, but also, you know, not for the general public. But more and more over time, you were working on inequality issues, which is somewhat, to some extent, connected to that, but also a lot of digging into data, more sort of facts rather than equations. Was that something that started with your move to America and your observation of inequality, or had you already begun to move in that direction?
Well, I was always a data guy.
Yeah.
So, you know, data has been with me forever. My mentor is someone who's not very well known in the United States, is Richard Stone, who got the Nobel Prize in 1983, I think, for his work originally with Keynes on developing double-entry national income bookkeeping accounts. So he was very much a data person, and I always wanted to be like him. So that part of it was always there. I think I've always been interested in, it's true that I broadened out, and I think we all do it as we get older, right? I mean, you know, you were probably broad pretty early, but you did a lot of narrow technical work early on. You've talked about the squiggles, you know, the alphas and the betas and all the rest of it that we used to be our work. And I do remember the first paper I wrote that didn't have an equation in it. And I was incredibly nervous, and I realized, you know, just how much props they were to me, because you could hide behind the mathematics, and you didn't have to come out and say what you meant in ways that other people might understand it. And my God, they might realize the emperor had no clothes, and you're just making this stuff up. So that's an adventure in itself, but an exciting one. But I've always been interested in what makes people tick, what helps, how their well-being happens and how they can affect it themselves. So the work about consumption and savings in the early days, very important for people to decide how much they save and how much they spend. And then, you know, as I've gotten older and broader, most of my recent work, the work I've been doing with Ann Case, has been on health and mortality and so on, but I see it as part of the same thing.
How do you pick what leads you to a particular thing to study, a particular country, or a particular issue to study? Is there a process?
Yeah, it's just curiosity, I think. I mean, I think it would be neat to know about that.
Something that piques your interest, or you hear, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, one thing that I actually kind of was hoping to find in the book and didn't, but I can ask you. So obviously, in terms of public impact, your work with Ann Case on deaths of despair, that's been enormous. What was the route that led you to study this? Because it is not this kind of thing that economists typically work
Well,
on.
I can tell that story because there are economists who work on such things. So one of my other persons I've always admired in my life is Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen has always argued that health should be seen along with material well-being, and that you couldn't look at how a country was doing or how people were doing without paying attention to that. So I'd always been interested in that. But there's a much more down-to-earth story. Ann and I were in a house in Montana, an incredibly beautiful place overlooking the Madison Valley. And I'd promised to write a paper on happiness, which I was interested in. And I thought one of the tests of happiness would be if you looked across places in the world, or states or counties in the US, were suicide rates higher when people were unhappy, or were they lower? Because a lot of people think the happiness stuff is sort of nonsense, right? And so if people are killing themselves, it seems like there's something pretty seriously wrong with them. Right?
If I can interject, there is a whole field of economics of happiness, subjective well-being, and the question is, but that's all based basically on asking people. And yeah, some of our colleagues don't take that seriously. I do, and obviously you do, but.
Well, I think it's important, but I've always come at it in a skeptical view.
Yeah.
So I called up two of the leading happiness researchers and said, is suicide and happiness positively correlated or negatively correlated? These people write papers together, and one of them wrote back and said it's positively correlated, and the other one said it was negatively correlated.
Okay.
So I said, okay, I'd better do this for myself. The answer, incidentally, across the US is there's no correlation at all.
Is that true?
Yes. And in fact, one of the happiest places in the United States is the belt down the Rocky Mountains, which is also the suicide belt of the United States. So that Montana, where we spend 5 weeks in the summer, has a suicide rate that's 5 times the suicide rate in Princeton, New Jersey, for example. So there are major variations, and they're not correlated. I mean, they're just uncorrelated. It's not negatively correlated, but because there are other places that go the other way. Anyway, I was writing this paper in one corner of the room, and I'd noticed that suicide was going up pretty rapidly in America among middle-aged white people. And I was going to put that in a paper that I was writing, and I thought it might be good to see how important suicide was relative to other causes of death. In the other half of the room, Anne, who suffers a great deal from mysterious lower back pain, which is many people suffer from and no one really knows what to do about, was writing about pain. And so at some point I said, look at these numbers, these mortality rates are going up. And she said, look, the pain rates are going up too. And that's how it started.
Okay, so synergy, and I'm just kind of amazed that someone in the health policy field hadn't sort of
So
caught
were
on to it.
we thought, if this is true, someone else knows about it.
Right.
And so we scanned all the journals. After a while, we started going around medical schools talking about it, and people's jaws just fell open. They said, this cannot be true, and it was.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe it was we weren't really in the field. It's not what we normally did. So we looked at it in a way that other people didn't. There's also a very big focus on health, on inequality, rather than actually the levels. So there's a huge literature on the fact that black and white mortality rates are getting closer together over time. And no one seemed to have noticed that at least half of that was coming from white mortality rates going up.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, by the way, is it still true, at least as it's often told, the deaths of despair, which I guess is suicide, alcohol, and drugs, and suicide. So I just said suicide twice. But anyway, a lot of it is in addition to being sort of middle-aged white people, is regional, that it's kind of the greater Appalachia. Is that still your understanding of it?
Well, what's still not true is when we wrote the paper in 2015, the first paper, we talked about middle-aged white non-Hispanics, which was the group where this was really happening. And our latest data in 2015 was from 2013. And you saw none of this in the African-American or Hispanic communities then.
Right.
But you do now.
Okay.
So we're often accused of having missed this. They said, well, Case and Deaton didn't look at the data. Well, you couldn't look at data that hadn't happened yet. But what happened was there was this sort of opioid epidemic, which was largely through prescription drugs in the first stages. And then eventually the docs realized what they were doing and pulled back. And that sparked an illegal epidemic, mainly of fentanyl, but heroin in the first instance. And that got into the Hispanic and Black communities too. So there's now not that much distinction.
Sorry, I'm getting too deep in the weeds here. The suicide and alcohol, is that following the same pattern, or is it only the opioids?
Well, one of the things about suicide is that women don't commit suicide as much as men, though you might argue they have a lot more reason to do so. And African Americans don't commit suicide as much as men do either. As much as whites do. But both of those have been rising through this thing, so the levels are different. You asked about geography. A lot of it is in deindustrialization or places that was mining. And you know, the places like Purdue Pharma targeted places where people's lives had come apart.
So that was kind of preempting. I was going to ask, what's your diagnosis of the cause? Why do you think this happened?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, and I don't think we know the answer. And, you know, Anne and I have very strong hypotheses, which we do think this reflects a disintegration of a large part of American society, particularly the 2/3 of the population that does not have a 4-year college degree. So this increase is, you're almost exempt from this increase if you have a 4-year college degree. It's like you have a vaccine. But if you don't have a 4-year college degree, this is all been rising. So the net result is much stronger when you divide it by education, which is that from 2010 on, nearly 2/3 of the population that doesn't have a 4-year college degree, their life expectancy hit its peak in 2010 and has been going down ever since. Whereas if you do have a 4-year college degree, your life expectancy kept rising up until the pandemic. And then there wasn't a very big tick down in the pandemic, and there was a huge tick down in the pandemic for people without a 4-year degree.
Okay, so this is the kind of, well, talk a little bit about the crumbling society, because what do you think of was going on? I mean, is it just deindustrialization? Is it
Well, I'm not sure there's much just about the industrialization, but you know, wages for males without a 4-year college degree have really been falling since about 1970. They go up and down with business cycles, but even in the good times, most recently, they're way lower than any time during the 80s. So that is one of the big driving forces. And as that has fallen, communities, and then they've fallen along with the deindustrialization and the loss of good jobs for people. So you could, for people who are not got a 4-year college degree. And as those jobs go away, the communities disintegrate. And so, you know, we'd start with the wage and the deindustrialization, but then you go to rising pain levels. You go to destruction of marriage. There was a big tick up in divorce, and then that stabilized for people with college degrees. But for people without college degrees, it's gone on falling. People don't go to church anymore, or people with college degrees still go to church with people. You know, so you've got a large number of people who are what the sociologists call deinstitutionalized, in that they have no connections with social institutions like churches or clubs, or which plays into the sort of Bob Putnam stuff about bowling alone. The unions have gone as those jobs have gone too. So working class people have very little power anymore. And the unions raised wages. They were an important part in social life. They gave political power at local, federal, and state levels. And all that is gone. I mean, the total lobbying by unions in Washington now is less than Alphabet spends in a single year.
Yeah, it happened. I was just doing some homework for some future column. I was looking at Ohio, and as late as 1983, as it turns out, so that's the first number I've got. When you came, a quarter of the private sector workforce in Ohio was unionized. Right. It's now 7%. And it's just this complete. So it's not. I mean, they lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, but even the jobs that remain pay far less, in part because the
That's right.
unionization collapsed.
And there's been very little success in unionizing service jobs, which is admittedly harder. But and there's also a huge attack on unions by Republican legislatures, both at the state level and at Washington. So it's much harder to organize a union than it used to be.
I don't want to take it. I have some.
Well, there's right to work laws.
It just turns out that the big shift when Walmart replaced General Motors as the biggest employer is during the Reagan years.
Right.
And there was a lot of a very hostile political environment to union organizing.
Was in some ways where it all started. Yeah.
Okay. Globalization. Since you have some thoughts, and I've done some mea culpas myself. What's your take on what did we get wrong about globalization? I'll give you my take.
I mean, I hesitate to speak on this. You're the trade guy. You got a Nobel Prize for trade. I'm going to get this wrong. And the basic theorems are correct, right? It's true that if you lower tariffs and you open up globalization, then there are going to be winners and losers domestically, and the winners and losers. The winners get more than the losers, so you could afford to compensate them. And in the textbook, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
But it never does, or it very rarely does. And that accounting doesn't take account of the externalities in the communities. I mean, the loss of other people's jobs. I mean, the loss of schools, the loss of tax dollars for the local community. And all this pain and suicide and stuff I've been talking about, that's not taken into account either. So I mean, again, we should talk about this, but I'm not saying, well, we should put 100% tariff on everything. I mean, that's stupid. It's just that the policy making has to not be a knee-jerk belief that more trade is always better.
Yeah. My own mea culpa, I mean, it's funny because you talk at several points in this book about economists neglecting inequality, which was never really true in international trade because sort of the roots of the modern field started with discussing impact of trade on wages and so on. But the big mistake that I think that I made was that we focused on inequality among broad groups. We focused on college-educated versus non-college educated, capital versus labor, and missed the effect on communities. Exactly what you're saying. I mean, they'll caught you in one small error. You talked about the furniture industry in South Carolina being devastated, and it's actually in North Carolina.
Okay, I'm sorry. Oh God, no.
But that's actually the classic example. You have this, the number of jobs displaced by Chinese imports of Chinese furniture is pretty small relative to the scale of the U.S. economy. That we have 1.5 million people get fired every month, but it just ripped the heart out of whole communities in the Carolina Piedmont.
So maybe I could get you to say that again, because people are attacking me up and down, and they say, millions of people lose their job every year. So what's trade got to do with it? And the answer is it's because of communities.
Yeah.
And that's not in the Economist lexicon.
No. And of course, it's also technology, by the way. If we wanted to ask, if you're talking about mining, that's really not, we never started importing coal. What we started doing was blowing off the tops of mountains instead of employing coal miners.
Right. Though presumably the two things are not independent. I mean, managers will adopt technology under threat from foreign imports too. So that can happen. I'm not sure how important it is.
Actually, I'm losing a little bit off script here, but you did say, no, maybe I can do it slightly differently. Let's talk about different advanced countries. And Europe has, globalization hits Europe, technological change hits Europe. There are blasted regions that have lost all of their reason for existing in Europe. I'll repeat that we were talking before, but I did a conversation with, I won't say who, I guess, but it was the eminent British economist who said, what we don't have in England is these sort of blasted left behind regions the way you have in the United States. And I said, have you ever been to the north of your own country? But what you don't have is apparently the deaths of despair.
Right.
So what is your explanation of why?
We do have deaths of despair in Scotland. So if your interlocutor said England, he was right. That it's much worse. We have a drug problem in Scotland, which is where I grew up, that's comparable relative to the population.
Which was news to me. I just heard that from you this afternoon.
Right.
But yeah.
I think there are two things. One is the standard sort of liberal argument, which I think has some truth to it. Europeans, this is a very broad summary. Europeans have a value-added tax, and they pay more taxes largely because of the value-added tax. They use that value-added tax to fund a pretty elaborate welfare state.
Right.
And there's also this argument that, I don't know whether Danny Roderick was the first to make it, but this argument is if you're a small country like Denmark, and you're very open to shocks from all over the world, you have to have a big government,
right,
because you have to have the ability to look after people who moved around. And you can't possibly, given your openness to trade, just preserve these industries in aspect.
Yeah.
You have to change them, and that takes a lot of government action, a lot of government money. So that's one part of the story, and I think that's important. The other thing is they don't let pharma companies do what they do here. They don't let pharma companies buy politicians who then run interference with the DEA to stop them selling drugs.
That's what I thought we were going to go, but then how do we explain Scotland?
It's not pharma companies, it's always been illegal. So I think if Purdue Pharma and J&J and others had not started this epidemic, it wouldn't be anything of the size it is today. Though I think you would still have. So the epidemic in Scotland is a bit like the meth epidemic in the U.S. in deindustrialized places. Social science isn't an exact science, so I don't know.
Okay.
And Scotland's a pretty small place, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It's smaller than New York City.
Yeah, it's actually startlingly small when you consider.
Which we know is a hellhole of crime and drug addiction.
That's right. That's actually one of those. Yeah. All right. I could go on about that a bit, just trying to keep track of it. So I'll give people a heads up. So you're casting some, at least skeptical questions about globalization and trade. Immigration,
Okay.
big issue of the day. And of course, and if you write saying calling yourself an immigrant, which is true formally, but what do you think we're getting wrong? Obviously we know that
The thing has become so poisoned politically that it's almost impossible for anyone to say anything that's sort of sensible about this anymore, and that may go on, and that's a very despairing sort of thing. And there are clearly, bad things happening, like huge numbers of people coming through the Darien Gap, which they didn't used to, which has stirred up all sorts of things. But I wanted to look at the broad sweep. It's sort of like economists think that if you have more of anything, you increase supply, its price will go down, except when we're talking about people. And economists have a hard time admitting that when it comes to immigrants, that immigrants might lower the wage. And there are two things, and I think Paul has slightly different views about this, but let me try them and then we could go back. One is there's a very famous graph that Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty drew in the late 90s showing income inequality in America as being enormously high at the time they first have data, which is in the very early 20th century. It dips down to a nadir around 1970, and then it's picked back up again until we're almost back where they were. There's another graph that looks hugely like that, which is the graph of the fraction of American residents who were foreign born. It was about 15% in the Gilded Age, and it went down to, I think, about 7. That number I'm a bit shaky on, around 1968, 70, and then it's now back to about 15% again. Now, the historian Jeff Cowie has a wonderful book in which he argues that the great migration of African Americans from the rural South to factories in the North could not have happened without the mid-century immigration restriction, because the factory owners would rather have brought in Serbs or Italians or Germans or Irish, but they weren't available because there were incredibly strict immigration restrictions. And so they were forced essentially to hire African Americans. And so the argument is that that is a wonderful example, if it's true. And remember, this is history, not formal econometrics.
Right.
If it's true, then that restriction of immigration brought up some of the worst treated people in America and really changed their lives in a really, really very positive way. Nowadays, I live in Princeton, New Jersey. My lawn is an immaculate piece of velvet. All the other houses, their lawns are immaculate pieces of velvet. The people who repaired my roof, these are semi-skilled or unskilled workers. And none of them were born in the United States, or at least their parents weren't born in the United States. And so I really suspect that very high levels of foreign-bornness are associated with higher inequality.
Okay, I'm going to just interrupt the flow and ask people to pass their questions, their index cards over. I guess someone will pick them up. Yeah, so we'll be taking some of the questions in about 20 minutes. By the way, we could talk that I used to believe that story myself, at least to some extent. I sort of don't believe it, but only sort of don't believe it now, because there's some evidence, and immigrants do take very different jobs from native-born Americans with the same seemingly similar educational qualifications. And the one thing that I would say about the Great U is one of the papers that had the biggest influence on my thinking about inequality was by Claudia Golden and Bob Margo on the Great Compression, which says that an awful lot of the reduction in inequality wasn't a gradual, decades-long thing. It happens in 5 years around World War II, and which suggests it has a lot more to do with power relations and unions than with labor supply. But that's wide open. Oh, and just to say, one of the things that we are having a surge in immigration now, and wages have risen much faster at the bottom than at the top these past few years. It's one of those things. I mean, obviously there are lots of factors at work, but but we could. It is true that at this point, saying I'm a little worried about the effects of immigration on inequality is, and not sliding into immigrants aren't people, as somebody or other said the other day.
I'm a person.
But is difficult.
But one of the arguments you hear all the time is immigrants take jobs that Americans won't take. Those people, anyone who says that should be thrown away, should be discarded and yelled at, unless they mention something about wages. Because the question is, you can't say Americans won't take that job. If you paid them enough, they would take that job.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things you learn in Economics 101, that you can't talk about moving these things around without talking about prices.
Actually, so let's talk about Economics 101, because this does kind of, in the list of topics that you were suggested in our correspondence, you mentioned the credibility revolution, which probably maybe 4 or 5 people in this audience know what that means, but there's been a big shift in the way that economists do economics over the past 30 or so years, focusing on, where possible, on things like natural experiments. We don't get to do actual experiments on people very often, The administration frowns on it. But the case that, yeah, I don't know if it was really the first in the credibility revolution, but you talk about it a lot, and it's also another paper that had huge impact on my own thinking is Card and Kruger, and then subsequent work on minimum wages, right. Where what they did was they looked, it turns out that given the U.S. system, where many states set minimum wages above the federal level, some cities do that as well, and they change, it's not synchronized, so we get experiments where one state raises its minimum wage and the state next door does not. The Card-Kruger result, the famous one, which has now been replicated many times, was that contrary to economists' expectations, that didn't seem to actually reduce employment when you raise the minimum wage. So, but there's like you say, about half the profession that says it can't be right, because Econ 101, demand curve sloped down.
Yep.
How would you react to, is there, I don't know, given what you were saying about immigration, are you fully convinced by the minimum wage literature?
Yeah, I think so. You said it had been replicated in many places elsewhere. That is a very important qualification, because the original paper is not a terrifically convincing paper, because, they had these, anyway. But they also did a very clever thing, which had not much done in economics before that, which was they knew this change was going to happen, so they went and collected data before, and then they collected data afterwards. So it was a rather simple set of calculations. That has been replicated many, many, many times since, and there's a very good paper by Aaron Doob in the QG in recent years, which was many states in the U.S., even though the federal minimum wage hasn't gone up for a long time, I think maybe most workers in the U.S. are now covered by higher local minimum wages that are higher than the federal minimum wage. And so there's been a lot of good work looking at that. Now, just to give you an example of the vituperation, another Nobel laureate, James Buchanan, said that Card and Kruger were camp-following whores. That was what he wrote in the Wall Street Journal. And he said, luckily, the rest of the profession has not followed them into being camp-following whores. And the camp-following whores meant, they were currying favor with politics, right? But even Buchanan had written a textbook in which the Card-Kruger result can actually happen. And that's the case when local employers have some monopsony power over their workers. That is a technical word, but it means they can squeeze their wage because many of these people don't have very many alternatives. So nowadays, it's hard to move, and mobility in the United States has gone down. And so if the employer can squeeze the wage down a bit, then what happens is if they force it up because the government gives them more, they won't fire the workers. They're just making a little less profit out of each one. And so the problem is that textbook 101 is not right. We're in a situation. And I think the great glory of that work and what's happened over the years is people are beginning to take market power by employers much more seriously than they used to do.
Yeah, it was one of those things that I think if it had been just the one result, we could have said, okay, maybe there's something idiosyncratic, but the fact that it's been replicated, Aaron Dubé's work, Aaron is kind of a regular at our events here, by the way. So this is definitely, I guess the question, well, all right, I could.
It's good science. I mean, it really is.
No, it's the closest thing I know of to actual economists actually behaving a little bit like real scientists.
Well, they change the theory. They go back to look at the data. They get new results. They integrate them. The theory gets modified, and it's had a huge effect on changing the world.
Talk about economists.
What?
About economists and their motivations. So I knew Kruger reasonably well and Card, and clearly they were not camp-following whores. But to what extent do you think that that kind of political motivations do distort the way economists do economics, and on various topics. Because I'd be, you and I have worked in different fields and probably have seen different things happen. But what would you talk about there?
I think there is, first of all, we've done very well out of the last 50 years. We're not the people suffering deaths of despair or watching our wages going down. And so, we didn't, I'm unimaginably rich compared with whatever I thought I would be. I'm not very rich, but compared with what I started out, let alone what my dad started out. And that gives you a very strong advantage to go along with the system. I mean, you have some built-in bias there. But I think part of the problem is that the simple-minded economics, the Economics 101, does have a sort of market bias built into it. Yeah. And so, if you've been taught by Dick Armey in Texas, you remember who Dick Armey was?
Oh, I remember.
Yeah. Or who's the other guy from Texas, anyway, who writes a piece in the Wall Street Journal every week saying there's no increase in inequality? Phil Graham.
Oh, yeah.
Who's a wonderful man. I mean, he's very folksy but very, very smart. And he really believes this stuff, and he learned from Dick Armey. And you can learn this stuff, and it seems like a real revelation. And so people think they're doing technical science, where in fact they're using tools that have a very deep conservative bias built into them. And I think that has been problematic.
The story I've heard, by the way, from people in the textbook industry was that Dick Armey, he was a professor at North Texas or whatever, and he wrote a public finance textbook, and it was a bust. It didn't sell, and so the only thing left to do was to take over the U.S. government. But that's what about more? I mean, certainly Econ 101ism. It's a very simple thing, and it does tend to make you. Although it isn't necessarily even there. There's nothing in the textbook if you read it right that says that. I mean, it's even if you believe that markets are efficient, even if you ignore all of that, it doesn't say that the outcome is in any sense fair. So, do you think that people
We've
just
become technical efficiency experts in a way that we didn't used to be? We were much more interested in philosophy and broad issues and so on. But it's true that you don't have to. I'll tell you a story. When I was a young research assistant in Cambridge in the early 70s, I saw a paper in a journal. It was the Journal of Political Economy, written by George Stigler, and the title of the paper was "Why Are Economists Right-Wing?" Right?
Yeah.
And it said that if you studied economics, it automatically made you conservative, which George really believed. But I thought it was a typo, right? Because I was in Cambridge, England, and the furthest right people I knew were Fabian socialists. Most of them were Trotskyists. Joan Robinson was wandering around Cambodia and China and extolling the Cultural Revolution. So all the people around me were, way over to the left. And they hadn't been affected by that.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think there's less of an. Let me ask, to what extent do you think actual sort of, or at least soft corruption plays a role? Something I worry about a fair bit.
Yeah. No, I think so. But, it's not always laid out on the table. One of our members has just gone to jail today.
Well, yeah. I've had some asking saying about economists, and then bringing up Peter Navarro, and I don't think he deserves membership in that club.
He has a PhD from Harvard. He
True.
worked with some very respectable economists, and he was selected for the job he had based on his economic views. Makes him an economist, I think.
Yeah, it's just I just look at it, and but what I often think of, I know a lot of people who do have consult for private equity, or in some cases, or even on corporate boards, and I don't think any of them are are taking email instructions on what to write in their next paper, but there's some kind of bias that comes out of, what kind of writing is going to get you that. I very much doubt that Claudia Golden has ever been asked to join a corporate board, let's say, or that economists who do focus on inequality, who worry about these things, that there is a kind of a subtle, maybe even unconscious incentive to.
Well, Claudia Golden gave her Nobel Prize to the Harvard Economics Department, which is a pretty remarkable thing.
That's pretty remarkable.
I could imagine a list of deserving people, and the Harvard Economics Department would be not anywhere near the top of it. She will also not accept lecture fees for talking about it. So she's a very, very unusual person. When I first went to Princeton, one of my colleagues was earning, in those days, about 10 times what I was being paid from his consulting business, and he was teaching too. And I would upbraid him and say, do you really believe? And he said, well, I would not testify on behalf of these people if I didn't believe in everything they say. I never testify, I never work for anyone I'm not comfortable with, which always, to me, told me more about the elasticity of his conscience than anything else in the thing. But I think we have to fight this on the arguments, and not by calling each other names. And I think there's been a bit too much of that already. And I do believe some people are what you say. But I mean, I do think we have to fight this out on. But it's partly. Amartya Sen argues that we made a wrong turn when we bought into Lionel Robbins' dictum that economics was about the allocation of scarce goods among competing ends. And that tends to lead you to markets, to efficiency. It leads you away from anything to do with social justice. It leads you away from anything to do with freedom if you want to be on the other side of that thing. And economists used to write about these things all the time. I mean, even Milton Friedman was, a philosopher as well as an economist. I mean, I don't have liked it, but, and Hayek was much better than that, even people on the right. But, Marx was a philosopher and an economist, and Keynes certainly was too.
The last note on my list of things to ask, it was, are we the baddies? Which was basically, to what extent do you think that the problems with economics have contributed to real-world bad decisions?
I think there's a lot to be said for thinking that through. I think the people who've run the United States over the past, since Reagan probably, have not paid much attention to working class concerns. They're not part of government. There was a very famous book about the Vietnam War called The Best and the Brightest, which showed what happened if you ran a country on intellectual grounds instead of having, a much deeper perception, other qualities that needed to be there. And I think we're likely to pay a terrible price for that.
I'm going to throw in, before I turn to the question, I'm going to throw in just a weird take, because I just thought people might want to hear it, which is, I think that at the moment, while there is everything you say about the market, free market bias and so on, that actually in terms of influence on policy right now, the weird thing is that the free market leaning economists actually don't have much influence because the current American right isn't interested in research or intellectuals or anything like that, and that basically they don't get the jobs making policy. And whereas if you look at the American center left, it does hire. I mean, if you look at the actual staffing of the current administration, there's a lot of progressive economists in there.
That's true in the current administration, but the current administration is very different from anything over the last 50 years. And I think there's a huge break, and it makes me very hopeful that, if they only get to do it for long enough, this really will make a difference. But I think, we've had policymakers that were, there's Larry Summers' famous comment, we're all Friedmanites now. And you want to think about what that means. I think that's just epitomizes where we went wrong.
Okay. Actually, this is sufficiently offbeat. Thank you for whoever came up with this. I just think it's worth asking. He said, many U.S. states have legalized cannabis for recreational use. Do you think that's wise?
No,
Okay, can you say why?
I think it's a very bad idea, yeah. I think it does things to people's brains that are not fully formed, especially young people.
Okay.
And I think, I despised this for most of my life, but there's some truth to it that it's a gateway drug to other stuff. And I think it's not a good thing. And I think addiction in all its forms is one of the worst things that's going on in America today. Any of you who've known people who've grappled with opioid addiction or alcohol addiction, and you can get addicted to marijuana, and addicted personalities will pick that up. This is a very dangerous thing we're playing with, and I don't think we should be doing it.
Worse than alcohol? Because
No, I think alcohol's pretty bad too.
but we try to.
Yeah, but maybe we should be pulling back on alcohol, not pushing out on new hallucinatory substances.
Okay. This is kind of related. What impact will the proliferation of gambling in the USA have long term?
Oh, I think that's another disaster. I mean,
Yeah, I figured that you would, given that response.
but this is what makes me more than anything else feel that we're all out there sheep who are being shorn by corporate interests. You can't watch a baseball game, you can't watch a football game without being incited to gamble on it, at least in New Jersey. I don't know what the rule is in New York. But that was, the gambling industry went after the state legislatures. They paid them a lot of money. It's much easier to buy, in quotes, not necessarily direct corruption, a state legislature. They're much cheaper than federal legislators. And they don't have the staff, where if you're in Washington, you get a staff who can do stuff for you. These state legislators don't have anything, so they're really easy targets. And the gambling industry has gone after them one by one, and they're making a huge amount of money over these TV ads, and they're causing addiction again. I think addiction is one of the worst things that we have in America.
Yeah, I have to say it is shocking how much stuff okay, someone will come down on me heavily, but
I'll protect
I would actually put in, I think in many ways, crypto is part of the same thing. It's preying on people a lot, and it's kind of horrifying that when I'm a heavy Venmo user, and that it's trying to sell me crypto every time I try to just buy something.
I agree with that. And I think when you listen to the people who talk about getting into it, they're the last people who should be doing that.
Yeah.
And the people who know what they're doing, like you and me, will have nothing to do with it. So, I mean, it's another widely disequalizing thing.
Okay. Angus, thank you. Thank you so much. Read the book. It's fabulous.
It's been a lot of fun.